Welcome to our next module here, and what we're going to start today is taking a look at the processes of cellular respiration. Now we set this up by taking a look at some thermodynamics and some enzymes biology and some energetics, and we talked about G and we talked about S, free energy and entropy respectively. But what we're going to do now is get into the mechanics of cellular respiration. So let's start out with just taking a general look at what is happening. So in cellular respiration, glucose in the presence of oxygen is converted to water and carbon dioxide. Now this is oxygenic cellular respiration. There are cases where bacteria and archaebacteria can do anaerobic cellular respiration, and that means they don't need oxygen. And we'll talk about where the oxygen comes from in aerobic cellular respiration right at the end of talking about all these processes. So it's what your cells do the majority of the time is they convert glucose into water and carbon dioxide in the presence of oxygen. So what we need to introduce here is the principle of oxidation and reduction, which are collectively described as redox chemistry. So during the processes of cellular respiration, glucose is going to be completely oxidized, and that is going to yield carbon dioxide. And the oxygen is going to be reduced, and that will yield water. So we've got to look at the redox chemistry, the reduction and oxidation chemistry that occurs to convert glucose to carbon dioxide and oxygen to water. Now, I know that for a lot of people the redox chemistry is a little bit intimidating, so this little video is going to be dedicated exclusively to looking at redox chemistry, and once you get the basics down, it's pretty easy to see it in action, and that's what's going to be important, is you're being able to see redox chemistry in action. So let's take a look at redox chemistry really quick. So there are lots of kind of word tricks you can use to learn about redox chemistry. I use the one oil rig. So the word oil rig can be broken down into oxidation involves loss, that's the oil part. Oxidation involves loss, and reduction involves gain, that's the rig part. So if you remember oil rig, oxidation involves loss, reduction involves gain, and what we're talking about the loss and gain of here are electrons. So remember, those are the subatomic particles which orbit around the nucleus of atoms, and so you can move those electrons around. Now the reason it's important to understand what's going on here is that when you move electrons from one type of molecule, a molecule such as glucose, to a molecule such as oxygen, what you do is you release energy, and that energy can be harnessed and used to do work. For example, it can be used to synthesize ATP, which is what we'll get to when we talk about the last few sets of reactions of cellular respiration. So let's take a look at redox chemistry in a little more detail here. Okay, so there are two molecules here, molecule A and molecule B, and you don't need to worry about those molecules are. We'll start giving them specific concrete names when we look at these processes in more detail. So what we're going to do is we're going to take molecule A and we're going to oxidize it. So go back to thinking about oil rig. If molecule A is going to be oxidized, it's going to lose electrons. So here are the two electrons it's going to lose, and so as those electrons are lost, that process is called oxidation. So that is a process. So oxidation is a process that happens to a molecule where the molecule, or the atom more accurately, loses electrons. And so once A has lost its electrons, it's said to be oxidized. So that's a word to describe its state. So oxidation is the process, and the product of that is a molecule which is more oxidized. So the electrons have to go somewhere. You can't just have electrons whizzing around in your cells. It's too damaging, and it contributes to things like aging, and it can cause DNA damage to other molecules that can lead to certain diseases. So the electrons have to go somewhere, so there's going to be a molecule which accepts the electrons, the electron acceptor, and that molecule, when it accepts electrons or gains electrons, is going to become reduced. So here is molecule B, and as molecule A is oxidized, molecule B, or atom B, is going to pick up the electrons and is then said to be reduced, and that is the process of reduction. So those are the two processes, oxidation and reduction. If you do one, you've got to be doing the other. So you can't just talk about an oxidation reaction, you've got to also think about a reduction reaction. It gets a little bit more complicated though. If we go back to our molecule A, which is going to be oxidized through the process of oxidation, because it is giving up electrons, it is surrendering the electrons, it is losing electrons, and another molecule is gaining those electrons, it's doing something to this other atom, this other molecule, in this case B, and it is reducing it. So in giving electrons to B, A is said to be a reducing agent, and because B accepts the electrons, that's said to be an oxidizing agent. It pulls electrons. So any molecule which pulls electrons from a source is called an oxidizing agent, and any atom or molecule which gives up electrons is said to be a reducing agent. So there are a lot of words to keep track of here. We've got oxidation, reduction, a molecule is oxidized or reduced, and molecules can be reducing agents and oxidizing agents. And what's going to be key is that you can look at a process, look to see if electrons are moving, and then determine, is this oxidation, is it reduction? What's the reducing agent? What's the oxidizing agent? What has become oxidized? What has become reduced? And so when we look at these processes in more detail from cellular respiration, that's what you're going to have to be doing. If you understand this, cellular respiration is a lot easier, and photosynthesis, which we're going to do next, becomes infinitely easier. Okay, so that is a little bit about redox chemistry. The last thing I'm going to do here is give you a big overview of cellular respiration, and my next set of videos are going to be me whiteboarding, because to describe this and talk about what's going on, it's easier if I draw it out as we go rather than just pointing at static images on slides. So traditionally, we break the processes of cellular respiration down into 4 stages. But before we look at the 4 stages, just as a broad overview, let's just refresh ourselves about the function or the purpose of cellular respiration. The purpose of cellular respiration is to take the energy in a molecule like glucose and put that energy into a different type of molecule that the cell can use, and that's ATP. So it's a transformation of energy, one chemical potential energy form, glucose. That's what we're going to start with, and we're going to finish up with a chemical potential energy form, ATP. We aren't converting the glucose into ATP. If we look at the matter transformations, the atoms of glucose don't end up in the atoms that make up ATP. So there are transformations of matter, and there are transformations of energy. Okay, let's go back to these 4 stages. The 4 stages are glycolysis, the breakdown or oxidation of pyruvate, the citric acid cycle, and then lastly oxidative phosphorylation. So you can have 4 videos that look at each of those individually, and then a 5th one where I'm going to put them all together in this kind of diagram that you've got on these slides here. So, function of glycolysis. Glycolysis starts out with glucose and it converts it to a molecule called pyruvate. When we look at that in detail, so what's going to be important is tracking the matter. We're going to keep track of the carbons. Remember, because the application of the first law of thermodynamics says that we cannot create or destroy matter. And is what we're going to be interested in are these 6 carbons that we start out with in glucose at the beginning of glycolysis. Okay, so glucose is basically converted to 2 molecules of pyruvate. The second stage is going to take pyruvate and is going to convert it to 2 molecules of carbon dioxide, which you're going to exhale. You don't need that, it's a waste, so that gets released, and 2 molecules of what ends up being called acetyl-CoA, and here it just says acetyl, and so these are 2 carbon compounds, and those 2 carbon compounds go into the citric acid cycle, and the point of the citric acid cycle is to oxidize the acetyl groups in acetyl-CoA, and that's going to release some carbon dioxide, and you're going to exhale that. Oxidative phosphorylation, it's going to take some of the molecules that we made in glycolysis, the oxidation of pyruvate, and the citric acid cycle, and it's going to extract energy from those molecules and basically use that energy to build the molecule ATP. So, glycolysis is going to break down glucose into pyruvate. It makes a tiny amount of ATP. We get out some of these electron carriers called NADH, which we'll look at a little bit next time. We do the breakdown of pyruvate, and that's going to give us some more NADH. Then we do the citric acid cycle, and we get more NADH and FADH2. And these molecules, NADH and FADH2, they're carrying electrons. So when we say glucose becomes oxidized in cellular respiration, don't forget what that means. Oxidation means electrons are being taken from a molecule, here it's glucose, or pyruvate, or the acetyl groups, and they're being given to another molecule. And the molecule that gets produced is either NADH or FADH2. So these molecules carry high energy electrons, and then the last stage, oxidative phosphorylation, is going to take the electrons out of NADH, FADH2, and use the energy that gets released when we do that to synthesize ATP. So those are the 4 main stages. I recommend that as I am diagramming out next time, in the next 4 or 5 videos, that you have this image kind of in your head or open in your book. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about to start with. Next time we're going to start getting into those more specific, the specifics of each of those processes. So we'll do that next time, and I'll see you soon.